Hello, I'm Scott Wipperman, the pastor here at First Presbyterian Church. And no matter who you are or where you are in your journey of faith, know that you're welcome here. We hope you enjoy today's service on this video, and we invite you to come join us for worship anytime that you would like, or join us in any of the other activities of the church. For more information about First Presbyterian Church, please visit our website at fpchelena.com or call us at 442-4775. God bless.
Our gospel reading today comes from Matthew. Jesus is telling a parable. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight the cry rang out, "Here is the bridegroom, come out and meet him." Then all the virgins woke and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." The word of the Lord. Joshua is the successor to Moses. Moses led the people up to the Jordan River on the boundary of Israel, but it was Joshua who took them into Israel. It was Joshua who secured the land for them. And as it was said, this is kind of his farewell speech when he's old in life. And he's calling out and asking the people, who is it that you're going to follow? Are you going to follow the gods of your ancestors? Are you going to follow the God, the Lord? Because he says, "For me and my house, I am going to follow the Lord." And the people all assure him, "Yes, we are right behind you. We're with you all the way." And Joshua says, "Are you sure? Can you keep up in following the Lord? Because if you say you're going to follow the Lord and then you start worshiping foreign gods, well, let's just say it's not going to be a particularly good day." And they assure him that they will follow God. And he says, "Well, you're testifying, you're being a witness against yourself here if you don't." And they acknowledge that fact. And then Joshua says, "Great. Follow those edicts of the Lord," and then he reiterates the covenant that has been made between God and all the people of Israel. Now, we're not nearly that foolish these days. We don't worship foreign gods. We don't have little golden calves that we bow down to. We don't have little figurines that we worship that you have to move from one place to the other because they can't do it themselves, right? You've got to move them. No, we're much smarter than that. We wouldn't do anything along those lines. I mean, those gods can't do anything for us, right? They're just little things that sit there. Why worship that stuff? Because, after all, we've invented much better, new and improved idols and foreign gods that we can worship, right? You know, we've got much better ones that can actually make an impact in our life. They can actually change something about our life, like wealth. You know, you got your savings account, you got your IRA and your 401k, you got your stocks and your bonds. You know, those can actually help you and do something in your life. Or what about status and fame and position? if you have that corner office, that can make a big difference in your life. If you got the right title, if you know the right people, those can make all the difference in how your life goes. We can worship those gods. Or what about worshiping the God of, not aging? Of course, none of us do that, right? We don't worship that God of not getting any older. Or what about worshiping the God of the gods that we create of things like, how many likes we have on Facebook, or how many followers we have to our Twitter account or our blog. Or what about maybe a God of efficiency? Our society seems to worship this God pretty big, doesn't it? Hey, things have to be efficient. If something's inefficient, we say it's no good, regardless of whatever the cost of being efficient might be. And in the corporate world, we certainly worship the gods of profit and of return on shareholder equity, right? Those are the two gods that we bow down to and worship all the time. So we have much better gods. We have gods that can actually make a difference in our lives, unlike these other people that just worship those old-fashioned gods, foreign gods and idols. But Joshua tells us, no, for me and my house, we're going to worship the Lord, not these other gods, not these other idols. And then Jesus comes along with this parable in Matthew. You've got 10 virgins, and virgins are not important. The term for virgins in the Bible could be used for maidens or young women, but you've got these 10 attendants to a wedding. We don't know a lot about the wedding customs back at Jesus' time back then, but apparently one of the common things was that the groom would come to the bride as part of the wedding. The wedding might be held at the bride's home. The wedding might be held in some community facility like the synagogue or some other hall. But wherever the bride was, the groom would come. And presumably the wedding would normally take place in the evening or nighttime. And so you had some wedding attendants whose primary responsibility was to usher in the groom, to have lights that would light the way and bringing the groom in and celebrating into the banquet. And the parable goes on that we had 5 wise ones and 5 foolish ones, right? And the 5 foolish ones came with enough oil in their lamp, but the 5 wise ones came with some extra. Because, as grooms quite often are, this groom showed up a little bit late, right? And while they're waiting for the groom, they all fall asleep, right? But then sometime late in the night, the announcement comes out, the groom is arriving, and they get up, and the foolish ones realize that their lamps are running out of oil. And so they look to the wise ones and say, give us some of yours so that our lamps will stay lit. But the wise ones say, unfortunately, we don't have enough oil for both us and you. So why don't you go to the cellars and buy some more oil? Now this might sound a bit harsh, but on one hand, had the wise ones shared their oil, it may be that the lamps could be lit for the foolish ones, but maybe halfway of the procession of getting the groom to the place of the banquet, everyone's light would have gone out. They would have all run out of oil. And then there would have been total darkness. Not a very good way to usher in the groom to the wedding. So they send the 5 away to find oil. But the groom arrives, and the 5 wise ones with their lit lamps go and usher the groom in to the banquet, and the doors are shut, the text tells us. Now the 5 foolish ones eventually come back and say, hey, we're here, let us in. And the Lord, the groom, says, truly, I do not know you. The foolish ones thought they were still part of the wedding party. Probably these women were picked because they knew maybe the groom They may have been more of the groom's friends than necessarily the bride's friends that would lead the groom into this wedding. But because of their ill-preparedness, the groom says, the Lord says, our relationship has been severed. You have severed it by not being ready. And then Jesus kind of wraps up this thing, telling us to be ready, because we don't know the day or the hour when this will happen. Now, there's lots of things that are going on in this parable. And some of them are very important to the message of the parable. Some of them are just there as supporting structures for the story. What things aren't particularly important? Well, one of them is not particularly important whether you stay awake or fall asleep. You notice all 10 fell asleep. That is nothing against or for them, because they woke up when the announcement came that the Lord was coming. And whether you were foolish or wise, whether you were simple or smart, is not so much the issue of this parable, unless it relates to your preparedness for the tasks that you have at hand. And oil here, oil in this parable, seems to be a metaphor for being prepared, the preparedness that we ought to have. But I don't think we need to try to extract from this parable what oil means and nail it down to something specific. It's just speaking for the preparedness that we ought to have. And whether or not the 5 foolish virgins ever found oil is immaterial to the parable. They left, they came back after the doors were shut. So what is this parable talking about? What is important in it? And I think it is being prepared. Being prepared for when Christ calls, when Christ comes. This isn't the only story in the New Testament, in the Gospels, of doors being shut on those coming in late. Because it would be a great dishonor in this story to the groom and to the bride, to the wedding, for people to show up, fashionably late and stroll in and draw attention away from what was going on. So once the groom and bride came in, they're the focus of the day. The doors were shut. Against any dishonor to the groom or the Lord in this case. Now, many times this parable has a rather eschatological interpretation. It's telling us to be ready, to make sure that we're prepared for when Jesus comes again. And there's kind of this ominous, you don't want to miss the boat, do you? Kind of overture to that kind of interpretation. You've got one chance to get into the kingdom. When Jesus comes, you better be ready for that chance. This is kind of an anxiety-producing interpretation of this. Because a lot of this is quite vague. For us that are kind of obsessive compulsives, we'd like to know the day and the hour, right? And what do we have to do to be prepared? There's no list anywhere in this whole thing that's talking about what we must do to be prepared for when the King comes. I mean, I got a lamp, I got a flashlight. I've even got the LED ones now, and the battery lasts a long time, so it'll probably work. But there's no explanation of this in the parable of what do we have to do to be ready for the coming of Christ. But aside from that interpretation, there's also a very non-eschatological, a non-end times type of understanding of this parable. It's of a parable. It takes this and brings it into the present and makes it a very short period of time. The groom comes, not once in the night, but many times in the night. And the groom comes from different directions, from different places, and arrives at different destinations. And he comes at different times, shows up when we don't know. This is Christ. Christ calls to us often, daily, many times during the day. And are we prepared? We can look at this as not something that happens once sometime long in the future, but something that happens over and over and over again every night, every day, as Jesus is calling out to us to do something. And are we prepared to do that thing? That thing which is our responsibility, just like it was these virgins' responsibility to usher in the groom. And just as much in the eschatological understanding of this parable, whether it's kind of a life or death situation, in this multiple times per day understanding of this parable, it's still life or death. Are we going to live and be prepared and enter into the life that Jesus calls us? Following his call, are we prepared to do what he asks us to do, or are we going to miss it? And therefore be dead in missing that call, in missing what we're supposed to be doing. Many times per day we have this option of choosing, are we prepared? Are we going to live into the life that Christ is calling us for, or are we going to not be prepared and not live the life that Jesus is calling us to? So Joshua asked the question, which gods are you going to follow? The gods of your ancestors? The gods of our own invention? Or are you going to follow the Lord? Because he says, I'm following the Lord. I and my household. Are you with me? And Jesus here in the parable is saying, are you ready? Are you prepared to do the things that you've been called to do? Have we sharpened our skills and our tools? Are our eyes open for when those opportunities come? Are we listening with our heart for when Christ is speaking to us and calling us forward to do something, to follow him, to step into life by following his way? Or are we going to not be aware, not be awake, and miss that? We probably all know people who are very self-aware, and we probably also know some people who are very non-self-aware, who have no idea of their strengths or their weaknesses, who have no idea of how they're coming across to people, how people are viewing them and understanding what they're saying. Christ, more than calling us to be awake, is calling us to be attentive. He's calling us to be alert. He's calling us to pay attention, to know how and what we need to do to be prepared, the oil that we need to have for what Christ is calling each one of us individually to do. And the good news is that if we listen to our hearts and we hear God's voice, this is not a hard path to follow. This is not something mysterious and vague that we don't know about. We just have to listen as to how we're being led by our heart, to have empathy and to pay attention and to notice the needs of those around us, and to see how God is calling us to respond to those needs, to help bring his good news into not only our lives, but lives of all that we come into contact with. And then we'll have plenty of oil for our lamps. And we'll be able to lead and walk with the groom into the kingdom. Amen.